Welcome, everyone. I'm Nick Hirschon. I'm an assistant professor of communication here at William Patterson, and thank you all for joining us for our first Hobart reality check of the semester, although we're not in Hobart today. But this speaker series is sponsored by the Communication Department under the leadership of Dr. Rob Quick and the student chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, for which I serve as advisor. And our goal is to hear from professional journalists who can offer insights into how the news business works and advice for our student journalists. So I'm going to begin tonight with some questions that I have for Ethan, but I want you, the audience, to be involved too by asking questions by social media. So we invite you to tweet your questions for Ethan using the hashtag Hobart Reality Check. So hashtag Hobart Reality Check. And then in the second half of the discussion, we will go to the questions. We'll put them up on the screen and talk about them. And thanks for Bree Testa for running our tech, and for Sarah Tawfiq, who's going to be doing the tweets for us tonight. And now I'll introduce you to our guest. Over 20 years at the New York Daily News, Ethan Sachs covered movies, television, comic books, and geek culture. He's profiled a who's who of Hollywood personalities from Ben Affleck to Ziyi Zhang.
Zhang Ji.
Yeah. Zhang Ji. Traveled to New Zealand to be filmed a performance capture technology and broke the story of Marvel Comics' decision to kill off Captain America, a scoop that was picked up by more than 4,000 outlets across the world. The work of which he's most proud, however, are the surprise charity events that he's initiated for the Daily News and later the Today Show, conscripting celebrities for acts of kindness for deserving kids. He is currently a comic book writer for Marvel Entertainment and a freelance journalist contributing reporting for NBC News and Today.com. So please join me in welcoming Ethan Sachs to William Patterson University. So Ethan, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So there's a lot that I want to talk to you about with your work covering the entertainment industry. But first, since our audience tonight is college students, a lot of potential future college journalists, I'd like to know if you can bring us back to what you studied in college, whether you were on the student newspaper, and if anything about your time in college informed your route to journalism.
It's funny because I went to a school in Montreal, Canada called McGill, and after the first year there, you're supposed to declare your major. So I went in and I said, I want to major in journalism. I knew from when I was a little kid that that's what I wanted to do. And the advisor said, well, that's nice and all, but we don't have a journalism program, and that's the kind of thing a reporter should have researched before they actually committed to coming to the school. But it was okay because I ended up studying political science and spending most of my waking hours at the school newspaper there, the Tribune it was called. And so I ended up learning a lot, but the most of what I learned at that age was through internships. And I had a couple of internships from these like small community papers in New York called Manhattan Spirit and Our Town. Mm-hmm. And that was great because they just sort of sent you out into the street and you did sort of, real reporting at the community level. And I learned a lot more there, I think, than I would have if I had only studied in the classroom. But that being said, then years later, so from there, I went and taught English in Japan for a year, and when I came back, the internet was just taking off. This was about 1995, and they were just throwing jobs, internet jobs at, so I got a job at this place called City Search. It was Metro B's called City Search. It was like an arts and entertainment listings place, and long story short, 9 months later, the New York Daily News recruited me, and I was like one of the first website editors, because they were just starting it up and they just needed bodies basically there, largely to work nights. And at the Daily News, I was there 20 years. For a time, I did a mid-career graduate school at Columbia. They had like a program for 2 years, and but I still think like I learned most like on the job. So definitely the internships were a big help because they indirectly got me my foot in the door at City Search. And I think that's true today, as it was way back then, that if you get the right internships, even if you don't stay in that particular organization, it can lead, it definitely helps the resume, and it helps you learn the skills that, when you do apply it more full-time work, it definitely gives you that edge, I think.
And one of the things that we've talked about in the speaker series is the importance of internships. Also, when you're now you've been an intern before, and you kind of saw some of maybe mistakes that you made or lessons you learned from what other people did wrong. Is there anything you'd give them as advice for what to do or not to do at an internship?
Well, I mean, this is going to sound horrible, but I think it's important to really work hard and sort of pick your battles. So if there's something that, not to sort of push back too much with certain editors. You have to kind of gauge how they are. Because I think what I did, certainly when I first got to the Daily News and I was a junior employee, I worked extra hours. I volunteered time. So like if I wanted to write something, I did that on my own time because when I first started, it was basically like a night production job. So that helped me start writing articles more full, eventually I became a full-time reporter and editor, but I think I couldn't have done it if I didn't put in extra work more than, maybe more than other interns or more than other cub reporters. I know it sounds terrible because essentially the whole internship system is you doing work that you should be paid or paid for much more than you get in the first place. And then, but I think it is important to sort of stand out and give like the impression that, you're the first person they want to hire when there's an opening or things like that. So I do think just really committing yourself to it is important, especially if it's an internship at a place you really love and want to work full time.
And you said when you were hired at the Daily News, it was mostly to work on the website, or solely, I guess, to work on the website.
Yes, it was solely at first. At the time, to give you an idea how long this was, we had a hookup by modem. I don't even know if you know what a modem is, but it's pretty old. So we would literally, because I don't know how much you know about New York newspapers, but the Daily News and the Post were, to this day, they're in this like epic battle. And it's always like you don't want the Post to get the scoop or vice versa. And they were so afraid of our stories at the time going live at a time that the Post could match it, that we had to physically sit there till 2:30 in the morning and then press a button, literally press a button, and then the site would turn over. And it would take about an hour. So you had to sit there and make sure it turned over. And of course, probably 40% of the time it didn't turn over. So you were paging, because cell phones were not ubiquitous at the time. So you were paging people. Our tech department, we were essentially leasing the servers. So our tech department was like in North Carolina. And so we were like frantically paging to try to get someone to fix it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not as glamorous as it sounds.
So then you saw the evolution of the way that the internet contributed to reporting and how it went from maybe being a print-first product to, we're print with a website, to being NewYorkDailyNews.com and Daily News America and all of those sorts of more digital products. So what were some of those changes?
The very first breaking story that every night our site essentially went live at 4 a.m. It was time to go live around 4 a.m. So the very first breaking story that we did was Elian Gonzalez, I think when he was returned to Cuba. And I remember my boss, the photo editor for the paper, was screaming at him, and I will clean up the curse words, but he's like, "You're taking your effing job. The newspaper's going to go under because you're giving it all free." So that was like the mentality at the time. But that was our very first breaking news story, and then, gradually now everything is digital first.
Right.
But that was not the case as of whenever that was.
Yeah, I'm curious, because this is something that now the young journalists here may be grappling with, but what took precedence when you have a scoop, let's say? Do you put it out immediately on social media? Do you run it past an editor and say, well, maybe we want to get something in print first and later we'll put it on the web? Or how were those decisions made?
I think, 15, 20 years ago, there was no question the scoop stayed because they didn't want to give the Post time to match it in the paper. Sometimes the Post would then get the scoop and we lost the ability to definitively plant our flag in it first.
Right.
But that was the edict from the editor-in-chief's office. So, but then probably about 10 years ago, it was not less than that, or not less than that. There was a change where they started to break things on the internet, thinking that they wanted to get the attention. And especially as social media took off, and then people noticed when you broke it. Not just the people that were, refreshing the Daily News homepage. So that's all fairly recent in the scheme of things, that they changed, that they wanted to be the first to have, the exclusive out there.
Yeah. Well, and then to kind of transition into some of the work that you're doing now, I said at the outset that you write for NBCnews.com, Today.com.
Mm-hmm.
So can you walk us through what is a typical day when you're working on one of their assignments? I know that there's really no typical day, but when you get an assignment for them or you've pitched them something, what are kind of the steps? How does that all work?
Well, NBC News, on Fridays, I just go in, it's a newsroom, just like the Daily News, only bigger. And I'm assigned pretty much general assignment reporting. They have a separate political division, so it's pretty much everything but politics. So it's unfortunately, it's a fair amount of mass shootings, weather stories. I seem to get only mass shootings and weather stories every Friday. I don't know what it is. So like the hurricane this past Friday. And they assign me, so sometimes I'll be writing 3 stories a day. Other times, it's for Aretha Franklin's funeral. I don't know if any of you watched it, but it was like 12 hours. So that was my whole day, was filing updates on literally watching the funeral. We had a television feed of it. And but most of the time, it's such a big organization that they have like reporters everywhere. So sometimes I get notes filed from them and I just write it up.
Okay.
And then today I always call it feel good or feel bad stories. So it's always like, oh, look at these cute puppies that are helping learning disabled kids, or it's the horrible story about the puppy that died. And they seem to only have 2 speeds. It's always misery or like really feel good. Yeah, so the most depressed I ever am is when I'm working on Today Show stories. But yeah, so that I do that part-time, and then I do the comics part-time as well.
Okay, and I definitely want to get into the comics and all of your knowledge of the entertainment industry. What I need to do now, and I'll have Sarah cue up some of these images for us, but kind of run through some of your stories that you've written for the Daily News, and I think they can each be used to illustrate certain points that I'd like to kind of go over different journalistic questions, and then you'll kind of see the stretch of Ethan's career and all of the different sorts of stories that he's covered. So if we could first put up that story about Sully, and we'll give it a second there we go. So I'll just reacquaint you if you maybe remember this, but this story ran on September 14th, 2016, but it's about this movie with Tom Hanks about the so-called Miracle on the Hudson. If you recall, the Miracle on the Hudson was January 15th, 2009, when U.S. Airways Flight 1549's engines were decimated in a bird strike. I guess it was a goose that flew into the engine or got sucked into the engine. During takeoff from LaGuardia Airport in New York City, all 155 passengers survived the emergency landing and were rescued from the waters between Manhattan and New Jersey by commuter ferries. And then a few years after that, we have this movie with Tom Hanks and Aaron Eckhart as the pilots of the plane. So Ethan wrote this story where he interviewed some of the stars of the film. So can you tell us a little bit about this experience?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed Tom Hanks, but also Sully himself, who I don't know how much you remember that it's, but he's like really together about everything. He was a little annoyed to this day that like when he brought down this plane, something had never been done before, the plane that size landing in a river. It was slightly on an angle, like slightly more than perfect. And to this day, that bothered him. So he's like that kind of personality. But yeah, I mean, I found it a little bit more uncomfortable interviewing him than, say, Tom Hanks. Because Tom Hanks I'd interviewed several times before, so it wasn't like, and he knows me from that, so like it wasn't that intimidating. But like, and it was only a phone interview for Sully, because I think he was in California at the time. And, but it was still pretty interesting. But the funny thing for me is I was part of the team that covered the news story when the plane went in, and then here, like whatever that was, 7 years later, I was covering the movie about the news story that I covered.
That's kind of wild.
Yeah, so it was kind of that was a fun one for me.
So is it easier, you feel, to interview the celebrity in that sense because they're so used to being interviewed again and again, or was it just because you had a rapport with Tom Hanks? Or?
Tom Hanks is as nice as you'd hope, so that's not the experience with every celebrity. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, especially nowadays in entertainment journalism, it's like almost like an assembly line. So you might get like 15 minutes with an actor, and then someone else comes in and they get 15 minutes, and then someone else comes in and they get 15 minutes. It's usually in a hotel, and so they'll have like one actor in room A and another actor in room B. So like you'll sit around all day and you'll be like, okay, Ethan from the Daily News, you're going to room C to interview, Chris Hemsworth, and then you go back and wait, and like, okay, the director of the movie is in room B, like you go and interview him there. So it's not as glamorous as maybe it sounds. It's like it's really, really regimented. So it takes out any spontaneity. Like I think for most types of reporting, with the exception of entertainment and sports, you go and you put in the work, and the more work you put in, the better the story is. But at the end of the day, like if it's a murder, you go and you door knock around a neighborhood. And I've done that plenty of times. And 1 o'clock in the morning, no one wants me knocking on their door, but you do it, and eventually you find someone who saw something or whatever. But you can't door knock at Chris Hemsworth's house, like there's security, and they're not really into that. So you have to literally do everything on the schedule that is given to you. So it's kind of, over time, it gets a little less glamorous, and so you get less starstruck because it's not as, it's not like you're sitting drinking champagne on a yacht interviewing Leonardo DiCaprio. That's unfortunately not how the job goes.
And we're going to talk more about some of the other celebrities you've interviewed, but is it difficult in this age because maybe celebrities have been over-prepared by publicists about how to respond, so you're getting the same sort of quote that they give every other news outlet, or how do you try to combat that?
Well, there's a couple of tricks. Well, first of all, 90% of the questions they get, if whatever the news cycle is or the movie that they're promoting, is the same. So they'll do hundreds of interviews across the world. They usually have for bigger movies, they have an international PR campaign. So they're going probably for 4 weeks, starting with the US or finishing with the US and going to England and Germany and all the countries, basically going around the world, ending up Japan usually is one of the last ones, and then coming back and finishing. So depending on where you get them, they can be the same person. To give you an example, have you all seen The Hobbit, or one of the Hobbit movies, or some people have seen it? So the guy who plays the main character, Martin Freeman? I had his very first interview on The Hobbit, because I went to New Zealand, so I had his very first interview. And he was funny and just energetic and really excited. And then my friend had one of his last interviews in New York. So he'd gone like maybe 3 weeks later, and he was surly, he was not very nice, because he'd been doing this for 3 weeks. Everyone's asking him the same questions. He's mentally been done with this probably 2 weeks ago. So it depends on when you get them. I try sometimes to do things to engage with them. So I do like a lot of research into them. It's like, I heard about your charity, or something to break the ice. Other things too is I ask open-ended questions. So like, something like 20 years from now, what's the one thing that'll bring a smile to your face when you remember about working on, this movie? So something like that forces them to give a story that maybe they haven't repeated 17 times. Mm-hmm. So, you definitely have to remember that it depends on the actor, but in general, they're not always as nice as you'd want them to be.
Right.
I grew up a big Robert De Niro fan, and I've interviewed him like 3 or 4 times, and it's not fun at all. He just kind of sits there, like with the scowl on his face that you've seen in a million movies, and he just clearly doesn't want to particularly be there, doesn't want to talk to you, and so he'll say, yep. And there was one question I had that really pissed him off. So then he went like that, and then that was the one answer he gave that was actually any good, because he was angry. So some actors, it kind of, you lose the starstruck the more you do it. It definitely, because it's not as glamorous as you would probably hope.
Right. Well, and then the last thing on this before you move to your next story, in these situations, are you often in the same room with the publicist, or is the publicist just setting it up and then you get to have a nice one-on-one? Usually,
well, it's pretty mixed. I hate when the publicist is in the room. Sometimes I had this weird experience where I was in London and I was interviewing Natalie Portman for the second Thor movie. And she gave me what I thought was a great little anecdote, which is we were talking about how weird it was. I don't know if you've ever seen the second Thor movie. If so, I'm sorry. But there's like a little scene at the very end of the credits. You know how Marvel movies have them? And it was, he comes in the apartment, he hangs his hammer on a hook, and he just kisses her. And it was a very passionate kiss for a comic book movie. So I said, is it a little weird, because you're both married now, and you know each other for so long, to sort of do that? And she goes, aha, you know why I was so passionate? That's not me. That was his wife. And what happened was they were reshooting, and Natalie Portman was on another movie and couldn't make it back. So they took Elsa Pataky as his wife, and they put a wig, like Natalie Portman, and they kind of filmed it in a way that you couldn't tell it wasn't her. And so he's giving this passionate kiss to his real wife. So I was like, oh, that's a cute little story. I didn't think it was that big a story, but it was a cute little story. Then I leave the hotel. I thought I was alone in the room with her. So I leave the hotel, and I'm walking down the street to go back to my hotel, and I get a call. It was maybe 5 minutes after I had this interview. And it's the head of Disney publicity, like in LA. She's like, you can't run that story. So it's like, well, how did you even know about that? I literally just, it wasn't like I printed something. It was literally like 5 minutes earlier. So apparently, they had a publicist hiding in the bathroom or something. I don't know, because she was not visible. So I don't know where she was staying in the hotel room, but she was clearly kind of doing like a little ninja thing where, I couldn't see her. So she was eavesdropping on the whole interview just in case something was said, which apparently. Now that was a case where I did not run that story right away. I said, I want to keep that story for the exclusive, but in exchange, I want to get another interview from, I'll play ball with you in this case if you provided us, the Daily News, with another like high-end interview. I can't remember who it was for a different movie. So I kind of forced Disney to do that. So in that case, it was in my best interest to sit on that story. If it was like a real news story, I would never sit on it. I would say, I'm sorry, like I didn't agree to those terms. But in that case, I kind of felt like we could get more out of it and then we ran the story like 2 weeks after the movie came out, and it did okay online. I didn't think it was that big a deal, but whatever.
Yeah, well, it's funny what they'll pick on, right? Or that for a publicist, it's a nightmare, it's a big deal, but for us, it doesn't seem that way.
Yeah, I know the publicists are so risk averse, so everything is like a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a funny one. All right, so let's move on to another story. This is the story about CBGB.
Oh, yes.
And so I'll introduce...
This name will mean nothing to them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'll have to introduce it to them. So this story ran on October 8th, 2006. But CBGB was a club that was opened in 1973 in Manhattan's East Village. And it was known as the birthplace of punk music. And Ethan said that he actually went there, I guess, as a teenager?
As a teenager, I would go there on Sundays because I was too young to drink and I wasn't smart enough to have a fake ID. So I ended up going there. Like they had matinees on Sundays, and it was like basically like hardcore, which means nothing to anybody nowadays. But a lot of bands like the Ramones used to play there, and like just years and years earlier, Television and like Blondie broke big there. So that was before my time, for the record. But they were closing down because of rent prices in New York. So this is like a big iconic club. So I got to go and spend like one of the last nights there. Like I think I'm there till like 3 in the morning or something. It was just really, for me, it was special because there were a lot of those hardcore bands that I had gone and watched that they were in the audience at the time. This band called Fishbone was playing, which again, probably means nothing to most of you. That's them up there. But yeah, it's a big deal for me.
Yeah, so we've talked about this with some of the other reality check speakers who've come, but when you have a lot of emotion tied to a story, and this is not maybe very emotional or sensitive, but is it a little bit more difficult when you're covering something that's so close to you or your own personal experiences?
I mean, I enjoy it that much more because I kind of feel like I snuck in, it's like I got the ticket to the chocolate factory. I got to interview George Lucas, which was, for me, was like my whole cultural touchstone as a kid with comic books and Star Wars. So I've gotten to meet a lot of the people that like I grew up either idolizing or really being inspired by. In fact, I think maybe I would have been a doctor or a successful businessman if I had not been obsessed with Star Wars. And so instead I went to a lower paying journalism job where I got to write about Star Wars. So I definitely think it was special to sort of see behind the curtain you know. I mean, my daughter wrote a few children's journalism stories for the Daily News and other places, and like she interviewed Steven Spielberg. And so I had this out, it was on Skype, but I was like watching my daughter like interviewing Steven Spielberg, and that was kind of a cool experience for me, because I was like, when I was 12, if I knew that was going to happen, I would have spontaneously combusted. And then here it is, like I'm watching it happen. So it's kind of like, I never get jaded to the point where you can't appreciate that, you know?
Well, that's fun. The fun part of the business, right, is that you may not be making a lot of money, maybe working long hours and not have a lot of job security sometimes, but
they're all going to walk out.
Exactly.
Like,
They've heard this
I'm
before.
transferring to engineering.
But you get to kind of live out these dreams, right? I mean, this is something like a movie that you loved growing up, a movie series, and then, or an actor, director, or in this case with CBGB, right? It's just a place that's very close to you, and now you get to be a big part of its history and document it. And
I got to write its eulogy, basically,
right.
which is special to me. But it's like that, I think, all over journalism. You know, you have, for example, I mean, you're really have a front row seat to history, is what it is what this profession is for everybody. Like, if you're really into sports and you get to, you know, cover the Yankees and you grew up a Yankee fan, or even if you just grew up a baseball fan, I mean, that's a special, you know, like if you covered the Islanders.
of course.
I wouldn't, but if you wanted to.
Ethan is a Rangers fan.
I'm a Rangers fan. This is really hard for us to be this close together. You know, it's special, I think. And if you cover politics and you're a politics junkie, I mean, this is a really interesting time to cover politics. You know, so you really are reporting on the things that will be in history books, you know, 10, 15, 20, 25 years from now, and you have that front row seat.
Sure. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to your third story that we're going to show up here. This is when the movie Creed came out. And so this article ran November 22nd, 2015, and obviously the movie Creed, you probably remember it, but it was a spin-off and a sequel to the Rocky film series, the 7th installment with Michael B. Jordan as Adonis Creed, the son of Apollo Creed, who was one of Rocky's adversaries in the earlier movies, and Sylvester Stallone reprising his role as Rocky Balboa. It was released on the 40th anniversary of the date of the opening scene in the 1976 Rocky. So I guess in this case, you interviewed Stallone and Jordan.
And yeah, they were together, and I really love getting two actors together, because then it takes a lot of the pressure off you, because it basically becomes a conversation. They're so excited to sort of play off each other. So like, you know, sometimes it can be really funny. Like, you know, I've been with like Ben Stiller and Kristen Wiig, who like when you interview them separately, they're surprisingly quiet and not funny. And then when they're together, they start playing off each other. And then they're really funny. So like in this case, they just definitely, like the relationship in the movie kind of spilled over into, you know, Michael B. Jordan was a lot nicer than Sylvester Stallone. But you know, one cool little tidbit was like, I got to speak to Michael B. Jordan a little bit afterwards, just not part of the interview. And I said, I heard you were a comic book fan. Like, was it disappointing you, Fantastic Four? Like, that seems like you won't get another chance with that franchise. It just didn't quite click the way you probably wanted it to. And he said, you know what I'd love to do? I'd love to play a Marvel villain. He goes, I'd love to be like the Heath Ledger of the Marvel universe. And then he didn't know he was going to be in Black Panther. That was, I mean, you know, his director in this movie directed Black Panther. So it was kind of nice to see then when the casting came out for Black Panther, it was like he got his movie, you know? Yeah. That's exactly what he wanted to do. So anyway, that's like a non sequitur, but.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, as part of this interview with celebrities, because you mentioned sometimes the one-on-one with the publicist, or when there are two or more of the stars of a film together, and we want to talk a little bit about press junkets.
Yeah.
So just to introduce that concept to the audience, press junket, if you don't know about it, is like the promotion of a product like a feature film, and the publicists and the distributors might corral all of the makers, the directors, the producers, stars of a film, for example, and they'll book some space where a bunch of journalists can conduct interviews. And so it can be a little bit like a gang interview in some ways, or just it can be, I guess, a lot of running around. And you've certainly dealt with a lot of them. I think we've seen them on TV, but what is it like? And are there any special tips for how to cover a press junket?
Well, press junket is pretty much what I was alluding to earlier with the hotel room, where you go, you know, from room to room, where there's a lot of sitting and waiting. Like basically, especially for big movies, like the studio gets, so when the actor signs like a $20 million contract, it's not entirely just here's your 20 million, show up on the set. They also have to do some things that they don't want to do, which is like publicity. So they're committed to doing X number of TV interviews and like, you know, X number of weeks that they have to do this. So they may say, okay, well, I'm going to do Good Morning America, and I'll do The Fallon Show after that, and that's it for the TV. And so there's a lot of like trading with their personal publicists and the studio marketing team. So one of the things they have to do are junkets. And the idea is that they're going to get as many reporters from newspapers and magazines and websites and TV all in the same place and churn through those interviews as fast as possible. Sometimes they do it kind of a little bit classier, like for the last Bourne movie, it was in LA, so it was kind of nice. So I went and you know, I had a couple days to lose money in a casino, you know, while I was waiting for all the interviews, but not while I was working.
Right.
But sometimes it's, you know, unusual places, or sometimes it's like I've done it on a sound stage in Hollywood, which was nice. They also have something called set visits, which is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, it's like when the movie's filming, there's like 1 or 2 days that they leave a scene and they're going to have all these reporters basically get to watch it. You can never photograph it, or you can't take your cell phone usually. But it's kind of cool because you get to see how a movie is made. The only problem with that is they usually do like unless you're Entertainment Weekly or one of like the really top sites or publications, they basically everyone has to do it together. So it's kind of, you might be with 15, 20 other journalists. So you all get the same thing basically.
Yeah.
So those are kind of two major ways that we get access to celebrities.
So when you're doing a story like this, where you know a lot of reporters are covering the same movie, interviewing the same stars, do you go in with a certain approach? If I really want to ask them about these questions, try to get something unique, or does it kind of just come out when you start asking questions?
Yeah, usually I break it down. So if I have 15 minutes, the first 5 minutes are fairly soft questions, very comfortable questions, so there's no chance someone's going to get out and walk out of the room and leave me with nothing. I have had that happen once or twice. But I usually get those questions first just so that I have something. Usually those are the same type of questions everyone asks. I hate asking gossipy questions. Once in a while I've been forced to by my editors because something, you know, there have been, I personally feel like if it's something that's newsworthy, then all bets are off. I have the right to ask it. For example, when 22 Jump Street came out, do you guys remember that movie? Mm-hmm. It's Channing Tatum and Jonah Hill. So that same week, a few days earlier, Jonah Hill had used a homophobic slur at a TMZ photographer. I don't know if you guys remember this story at all. So it was like a couple days later. So I cannot not ask about that. Like I said, because they said you can't ask about it. The publicist called me after this interview was already set up. Said you can't ask about that. I said, well, I'm going to ask about that. So I'm going to be honest with you. If you put me in the room with him, I'm going to ask that question. It was like, well, that's unacceptable to us. And I said, you can't expect, it's not like I'm asking about his love life or something intensely private. He was on a street, he said something, you know, horrible it's caught on tape. It's not like it's a he said or something. So then they worked out, okay, you can ask the first question, and that's it. So I asked it in a gentle enough way because I knew if I ask, like, I can't remember how I phrased it. It's a few years ago now. But it was like, you know, basically, you know, if you could talk to members of you know, the LGBTQ community and what would your message be, you know, 2 days after, 3 days, whatever. It was something like that. It was a total softball question to allow him to address it on his terms. Because I knew if I just asked something, it would be like a quick, otherwise, if it wasn't an open-ended question, it would be like a quick,
right.
You know, if it was like, how horrible are you? That would probably shut down the interview. But it was a joint interview with him and Channing Tatum looked like he did not want to be there. So it was just like, it started everything off on the wrong foot, but it had to be asked. Because like that, you know, that happened. So that's rare though, that there's like because these movies, usually there's not as much those sorts of
controversy.
Yeah, in the moment there isn't.
Right.
Usually they space their controversies out a little bit better.
I want to move on to another story of yours. This is what we alluded to earlier, the Captain America kill.
Yes.
So this is from March 7th, 2007. And your lead might be a little bit hard for them to read out there, but you had a dramatic lead on this one. Captain America is dead. The Marvel Entertainment superhero, created in 1941 as a patriotic adversary for the Nazis, is killed off in Captain America number 25, which hits the stands today. So we don't talk much about comic book journalism, which is a really
changed my life.
Interesting niche, and it's a really just a fun thing I'm sure to discuss. But how do you even work with I guess you're working with Marvel in this case to develop some sort of trust so that when there is some big exclusive coming up, they think about you and they actually trust you to be the guy?
Well, it's like covering any other beat, right? If you're covering the transportation beat, you have to know all the major players. You have to know all the unions. You have to know all the government agencies that are part of the transportation, or else you can't really cover it. So same thing with comics. I had to start to get to know the editors at Marvel and DC and the other places, and I didn't just do comics. It was like geek culture, but comics. There were a couple of people. There was a guy at the Times, George, who's now a friend of mine, but we were always competing for the same. But the story of this one, I didn't think it was going to be that big a deal. But what happened was a couple of issues earlier in this series called Civil War. Any comic book geeks out here that know what I'm talking about? Probably not. One person half raised there. Kind of embarrassed. But Spider-Man unmasked himself publicly. So that was like, and the Post ran a story. Anytime the Post got something that you didn't, you may remember this, you'd get yelled at the next day. Even if it was like not possible for you to get it, or once in a while the other side wins. It just happens. The next day is the next day. But I got yelled at so much for that one. They were people who never picked up a comic book, even when they were kids. They were surly kids, but they got really excited. So I called Marvel and I said, why did you give that to the Post? If you gave it to both of us, you'd have two stories. They said, we'll make it up to you. We're going to do something soon. So then they killed off Captain America. But they didn't really kill him off because it's comic books. He was actually shot by a gun that sent him through time. Of course.
Of course.
It's torn from the headlines.
Happens to all of us.
But I didn't think it was that big a deal. But what happened was it was a news day where there was nothing else in the cycle when this thing broke. So everybody picked it up all around the world. It was like, it was the #1 story of the Daily News in terms of pickup for that year.
Wow.
This #2 was that Al Sharpton was related to Republican senator. I can't remember. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, barely.
That was the #2. So this was actually that one, which was much more important. But a lot of specifically conservatives were outraged because they felt that Marvel was making a statement because this was during the latter years of the Bush administration. So it was like they're making a statement that Bush has killed America. But honest to God, they were just trying to sell comic books. So it became this big controversy. So a lot of Republicans see the liberals at Marvel. So this story got picked up by a lot of places. So that was. But what I'm happiest about was I interviewed one of the two creators, the original creators of Captain America, two guys, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby is kind of famous for co-creating many, many, many things in comics. But Joe Simon was still alive, and he was kind of living in a really dingy apartment in New York. So I interviewed him for this, and then he got a lot of coverage. And I'm not saying there's a direct line, but eventually Marvel gave him credit, because Marvel, they were in fights for many years over the rights, but they reached a deal and he got his credit. Before he died, he got to see his name back on the comic, and when the first movie came out, his name was on the screen. So that was all, like he was kind of forgotten. I'm not claiming credit for it, but it was kind of nice to see that, him getting that back.
Right, yeah. Well, and we want to continue with Captain America because I want to play a video in a moment. And just as Sarah cues that up, I want to remind you that you can tweet out using #HobartRealityCheck, because after a few more questions, we'll get to any questions that you might have as Ethan is talking. But we're going to play a video, and I want, Ethan, if you could just introduce this to us maybe right before Sarah starts before she presses play. Or we'll stop it there.
That's me, not Chris Hemsworth. I know I know it's confusing, but no. So this is the thing I'm proudest of. It started with the Marvel movies. We basically did these charity events, and part of it is slightly cynical by the media outlet, first the Daily News and then Today, because they get like a lot of coverage and hopefully it goes viral. But basically the idea is you find a kids charity that is kind of makes sense for the movie. Like, so for example, superhero movies are easy because, it's subject heroes, right? So this charity was kind of a really cool charity. It's called Celebrate You. And it was started by some teenagers, and they basically go to homeless shelters and they throw birthday parties for kids that wouldn't have birthday parties. So we thought, okay, well, this is great. Disney rents out a theater. We'll publicize, we'll film it and everything, and it'll be in the newspaper the next day. And Chris Evans, who plays Captain America, will come and surprise. It'll be like a superhero-themed surprise one of these deserving kids from the homeless shelter. And it turns out, and you can't do that because a lot of these kids were domestic abuse survivors. And so they can't be on camera. And there were lots of rules, which makes sense, but we were lay people, we didn't really know until we heard the rules. So we found this one 12-year-old boy, Archie, who was one of the volunteers for Celebrate You, and it was his birthday like a day later. And he'd volunteered for a number of years, and I think he was being bar mitzvahed the next week or something, and he was donating all his money to the charity. So we figured, okay, well, this kid is worthy. So we surprised him, and he just kind of broke down and cried, which we didn't expect. We thought, But anyway, that's you can see it in action. But the cool thing about it is, like, when you get it right, it's a very special moment. It goes viral, so it draws a lot of attention to the charity, which for me was most important. So maybe it gets some donation money, gets attention. Deserving kids get attention. Just did one a few months ago for Today.com where Chris Pratt came, and he was involved as a kid with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and he surprised kids in a screening of that. And he was only in New York for like less than 24 hours, but we carved a time after he left Fallon before he had to go somewhere else, so we got him. And it was very special, because it was special to him, and it was special to the kids. Like, the kids, they'll never forget that. So that, for me, that was like, I know it's sort of making news rather than reporting on news, but it was very special to be able to use those contacts with studios and personal publicists and sort of make that happen. Sure. So that, for me, is...
Yeah, so let's see if we can play the video, and then we can talk about it on the other side a little more.
The first of several surprises, guys. So speaking of birthdays, we have a bit of a surprise birthday party. It turns out that one of our volunteers at Celebrate You is about to turn 13. His name is Archie Silverstein. Archie has not only volunteered helping throw shelter kids' birthdays, but he is donating his bar mitzvah money next month to the cause. Guys, maybe if we start singing Happy Birthday, we can get the cake to finally come, okay? And better yet,
Happy birthday, dear Archie. Happy birthday to you. What's up, buddy? How are you, pal? It's for you. Happy birthday, pal. Smile. Hey, buddy, congratulations. Good job picking out that money. You're a real hero. Good work, buddy.
make sure.
Hey guys, happy to be here. Happy to be here. I hope you guys love this movie. Buddy, you're a real champion. I heard what you did. I think that's really heroic. I don't know. I guess I'm I'm happy you guys are going to get to see this. We worked really hard. I hope you guys like these. Are you Team Cap? Yeah! All right, That's all I needed to know. That's all I needed to know. You're gonna like this one. I think this is the best one so far. I really do. So, tell him. Let him know. I dare him to come down here. All right, guys, enjoy the movie. Have a good time.
So as you were watching that, I noticed even you get emotional watching it, right?
Yeah, I wasn't crying though, for the record. It's like the lighting sometimes, beads of sweat, you know.
But another theme that I've tried to raise a lot in the speaker series is the importance of sort of that compassion or not losing touch with kind of what, like you were talking about your own experience. If you were a kid and you had gotten to meet Mark Hamill or Harrison Ford when you were growing up in the Star Wars movie or something, it would have been a huge deal, right? So it seems like that's some of what you bring to your reporting now.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky to cover a beat that I actually really liked. So I got to, I basically, I don't know how many of you feel the same way, but like part of me is always a 15-year-old kid, even as I'm 45 now, but so I'm like 3 15-year-old kids. So I found something that I got to do where I could continue to channel what I loved, which is rare. It's like the way it all comes, and this is oversharing, but my father by his parents was forced to be a dentist, and he was a prison dentist of all things, and he hated his job. I mean, hated it every day. So he used to say to me, "You have to find something you love doing, because it's like forget about the money. Like most of your waking hours, are going to be doing this thing, and you have to love it, because if you don't, you're going to bring it home to your family. There's no money that's worth that." So he said, "I'll support you. Whatever you want to do, I'm there for you. As long as it's not dentistry, in which case I'll break your fingers." So yeah, I didn't go into dentistry, but so I mean, I think it's important, and so I've been lucky that for most of my career I've been able to do exactly what I love to do. Even now, where it's slightly different, but yeah.
Yeah, and even so much that as we move on to our next and last image, you've gotten your daughter involved, which you mentioned earlier, and so. You actually said this was one of your career highlights. We'll pull up that photo. Was in December.
Yes.
December
the
2012.
Incredibly overweight person in the gray unitard is me. So he asked me what photos I want to pick. So of course I'm gonna pick that one. But that one was really cool because we flew to New Zealand. I flew my daughter and my wife to join me, but I was flown to New Zealand, and we got to do. This was for the first Hobbit movie. We got to do. That guy on the right has 4 Oscars for visual effects. I have no Oscars. But we were doing motion capture technology. It's the same, or performance capture technology. It's the same thing that from Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and where literally you do these motions, you do these movements and facial expressions, and they're markers, and they're cameras all around, and they pick up your movements, and they put your movements onto a digital skeleton of something else. So in this case, I was typecast as a troll, and my daughter was a dwarf. So somewhere we have video footage where it's where we're acting, and it's like a scene from Lord of the Rings. It's pretty amazing to live through, and I got to bring her to it, so that was pretty special. That's my favorite thing I ever got to do. I mean, it's crazy.
So, I mean, obviously, it's great to share that with your daughter, and it seems like she has a lot of the same interests that you have. And do you hope that she'll become a journalist? She's obviously done some journalism, you said, for the Daily News.
I don't necessarily hope that she'll become a journalist for 2 reasons. One, I'm a little unsure yet of what direction the whole industry is going. I love it. I think she loves it a little bit. But the other more important reason is I want her to find her own path, which is I didn't go to dentistry, so I'm not forcing her to go into journalism.
Of course.
She loves it now, but to get where I was, I had to, run through a lot of crime scenes and do type of journalism, which I found very hard to do. I put in a lot of hours and things like that, so I don't know that it's as glamorous as you don't go from 0 to 60 right away. So I think I'd like her to find her own way.
Sure.
And if that's what she wants to do, great. But I certainly am not you've got to do this.
Right. But either way, she's getting all these awesome experiences.
It's great
with her
at
dad.
12 to 14, to have those experiences. She got to. I don't know if you've ever seen Moana, but the actress who does the voice, is Ali Carvalho. And she got to, before Moana came out, we had to deliver my daughter, who was like 12 at the time, to a stranger, Ali's mom. And they were fresh from Hawaii. They'd just come from Hawaii. And they got to go to Hamilton, which at the time was like really hard to get into. So they had Lin-Manuel Miranda's private seats. So like 5th row. So the 3 of them went together. And my wife and I had to stand outside the theater, like our ears to the door, till it was done. But then she went and she had like an hour interview with her. It was like, and she prepared, she had all her notes and everything. And then she got to interview her again a year and a half later for this show called Rise, which was on NBC. And Ali remembered her because they had spent like 6 hours together. And so like, she hugged her and she's like, "You got so big," and I guess I did too. And it was like, so for her it was like, that's great. You got to see Hamilton. You got to meet this actress who's as cool as you would like her to be and as sweet as you'd like her to be. But that's not really the job. Like, people don't give you Hamilton tickets. That's not really how it works. So anyway.
But yeah, no, but it's fun that you've been able to involve her. All right, I have other questions I want to ask, but I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to get some questions from the audience in. So if we can put up the social media questions, we'll see it, and you guys can still keep tweeting out. But let's see if there's anything up there, Ethan, that you want to pick on. I can start it out with.
Go on all of them.
Oh yeah. So we have Maria Zuniga, who is the president of our SBJ chapter. What are your favorite stories to cover and why?
I always like, that's a good question. I always like entertainment stories that are newsier than the typical celebrity profile or things like that. So for example, if they're, I didn't cover this story, both because I'm doing less pure entertainment journalism now, but when Crazy Rich Asians comes out, it's a moment where rightfully there are a lot of stories about whether or not this is going to be a major sea change for Hollywood, where Asians have been traditionally completely not represented at all. So like that sort of diversity story interests me a lot more than, okay, here's a profile. I love Michelle Yeoh, but rather than here's a profile of one of the actors from the movie. I did some entertainment business stories, which I really liked. So for example, like the Ziegfeld, which was one of the last old school movie palaces, and it closed down a few years ago, but sort of how they're struggling to stay, this was a few years before it closed down, but how it's struggling to stay in business and like the obscene amounts of money it costs to keep the lights on, and how like they get just the, this wonderful movie palace was, you could see the handwriting on the wall. And so things like that where it's a little bit more work to do the story and isn't just driven by celebrities. I definitely did love that Sully story, but again, it was because of the news peg to it as well, like getting to revisit the day with Sully and having him talk me through the whole TikTok of what happened. So that was like a special one for me. And even like, there was one, are any of you Game of Thrones fans? Okay, so I got to do a story on the Red Wedding. And so talking to all the actors, unfortunately this was by phone because they were all on the, not in New York. But I talked to George R.R. Martin, who was the author, and I talked to Richard Madden, who played the Robb Stark. And I hope I'm not spoiling anything for you, but he dies. Horribly. So he told me this story that I always thought was like such a great little anecdote where, so he gets killed and he's very emotional because he loved his character and it's such a horrible way to go. And the guy who kills him on screen, the actor who plays him, I forgot the actor's name, but Royce Bolton's the character. He like shakes his hand, they embrace, and then he goes off on the set and immediately he gets on a plane and flies back to London. This is in Belfast. So he flies back to London and he's just weeping on the plane. He's just like, sitting there crying. Everyone doesn't know. They think he's a freak because he's just crying, sitting by himself and just weeping because his character was killed off. So I just love that idea that it was so horrible that even the actor couldn't get over it on the plane back to London. So I thought that was like hearing those little details. So then I pieced together a story and I was really proud of that story because we got all these details that the Post didn't get. So yeah, I like things that are not just, what you get from sitting in a hotel room for 15 minutes.
Well, and learning that the actors are as passionate about this as you are, right? Obviously.
Some of them. Some of them, it's a paycheck.
But I think those moments, make you feel like, all right, it's worth staying involved in the business. So let's see what else we've got here. So we have a question down there. How do you balance your work life and your private life? Well, you have your daughter help you with this.
Well, the funny thing is now, it's in a way slightly harder because I work a lot more hours because of the comics but for the most part, most of the freelancing I do is from home. So at least I'm in the same room as my family. So it's a little easier to balance. But I have included my daughter, especially, in a lot of stuff. This is not journalism related, but I wrote her into one of my comics as a character, as a fairly minor character. But she's going to New York Comic Con and cosplaying as herself. So the artist actually drew like a fashion sketch for us so that my wife likes to make costumes, so, or outfits, not really costumes, but she's making that one. So that's kind of a fun way to combine it.
That's really awesome.
Yeah.
And so when you started your career, 'cause you said you were working overnights for a while,
Yes,
right?
a long time.
So then how did that work with work-life balance?
Well, I got married actually while I was working on the night shift. I just didn't sleep very much. Like, honestly, I couldn't do it now. But the first few years of my daughter's life, I was working nights. And then like my wife would go to work and I'd have the baby during the day, so I had that time. And then I'd go and try to stay awake through the whole night shift and then come back, get 3-4 hours sleep, and then start it all over again.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can do a lot more like when you're 32 than you can when you're 42.
Right. Well, these are things that's why starting journalists, right, end up with those kinds of jobs, and then
Yes.
you move
You
up
work
and
your way up,
you work out of
definitely.
that. All right, we have Juliet Ruiz from our SBJ chapter asks, did your political science degree help you in any way with your journalism career?
Probably not. It depends what you're going for, though. Obviously, if you're covering politics or international news, then it would be a big help. I found it fascinating, actually. I mean, sometimes the critical thinking, translates, but I think for me, it didn't necessarily. I'm glad I did it, but yeah. Wish I had a better answer for you.
Do you recommend any sort of major or minor that people should take if they're interested in the kind of career that you've had?
I think, fortunately or unfortunately, experience is very important to journalism. So if you can start the ball rolling on internships, I think the biggest key too is at this level that you're at now, at this age, find the person doing what you want to do, email them and say, hey, Jane Smith, I'm a big fan of how you handle your beat. I would love to, next time I'm in the city, if you have some time to talk to an aspiring reporter, you'll find a lot of these people love to pass it on because someone did that for them. So I think the single best thing you can do is to hear from that person that you most feel inspired by and you most want to model, to get to that stage, because you're never going to get to that stage right away. It's going to take you years to get there, so it would help if you know the best way to do that. And then sometimes they know people, and they're, as they get to know you, you're not just someone who emailed them, but you just, you have to be kind of very polite about it and not belligerent and not expecting them, upon demand to meet with you or whatever. Send them a polite, gushing fan email or something that shows that you've been reading their stuff, that you're not just going off a list or something. And then chances are they'll get back to you and it starts a conversation and then you learn. A lot of us I've made some mistakes here and there along my path that I would love to tell an aspiring journalist, don't do this, I'll save you the trouble, don't do this. And people did that for me. Corky was a big mentor for me. David Hinckley was a big mentor for me. It really does come around. And when you get old like me, maybe you'll be doing that too to some kid.
Yeah, and so it's important to remember that a lot of journalists do want to pay it forward. People,
Yes.
They remember what it was like when you're starting out and you're thinking, how will I ever reach that height? Which is, I guess, what you're doing here today. Yeah, for us.
I thought we were just hanging out. No, but seriously, I think this is a profession where it's not just a job. Very few people go into it for the financial. You can make money in it, but it's not okay, I'm going to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Then you're going to make money. But this is something where you go in because you're passionate about whether it's entertainment or sports or news, or telling people stories that aren't getting heard. Like that is something that there's a huge void, especially outside the coast, where like in Flint, Michigan, like people need to be on top of the fact that the water still is horrible. So like that can't leave the news cycle. There have to be people telling that story. So there needs to be people that are committed to it, and that is their driving force. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No. Let's see if we have other questions that we have. We have John Fiorino, also from our CBGB chapter. What was your favorite interview?
Tom Hanks is definitely one of them. Not that one, but I've interviewed him a few times. I got to help him because he was playing a Daily News columnist a few years ago, Lucky Guy.
Yes.
He played Mike McAlery, and I was so old that I had been a Cub reporter the same time Mike McAlery won the Pulitzer and was at the. So when I interviewed Tom Hanks, I told him that like we're really, inspired by this at the Daily News because I actually knew Mike McAlery, and so then he contacted me separately and asked me if I would help him research. So I put him in touch with people. So I did help him research for that role. So he had given me some interviews that he wouldn't have, I don't think, given to newspapers because he's usually doing like TV and some of the core magazines. Mm-hmm. So he was definitely just a fun guy. Who else? Why am I drawing a blank? I love Guillermo del Toro. I've interviewed him probably about 15, 16 times. He is the biggest, not only is he's like the nicest guy on top of being the biggest nerd when it comes to the same type of stuff I love, because I also love horror and things like that. So like, he has a sketchbook full of sketches, so he showed me a lot of that, like, stuff that went into like Hellboy and Pan's Labyrinth, and so he was fun. Helen Mirren is incredibly smart. I'm sure I'm missing some big ones that I really loved that I can't. Well, Steven Spielberg was great. Matt Damon, I love. He was very funny. A lot funnier than you'd think. Halle Berry is great. Yeah, I'm just naming names at this point. Not really giving you much useful information.
You were talking about Star Wars before. Did you ever get to interview a lot of the Star Wars
actors? Yes, I interviewed Carrie Fisher, who was fantastic. She was a little slurry at the time, slurring her words a bit, but she just was so smart. And it's funny because I interviewed her, I interviewed Mark Hamill, and I interviewed George Lucas, and never interviewed Harrison Ford, but I told them the same story, each of them, because it was very special to me. My first memory is being 4 years old when the first Star Wars came out, and I'm sitting in the theater with my father, and when that music comes on, I literally am like 4 years old again. And my father's since died, and like in that moment when I hear that music, it's like he's alive again. It's like that emotional for me. So I told that story to all three of them, thinking, okay, it's a good icebreaker on top of it, but it is a true story and it means a lot to me. And I want to share that they mean a lot to me because of it. So like Carrie Fisher went like this, and she was like touched. I hope I didn't knock the microphone. And Mark Hamill was like, oh, that's really sweet. And then he went on a 11-minute story that was only vaguely related, but he clearly was like a conversation. And then George Lucas looked incredibly uncomfortable and wanted, it was like completely not the reaction I was hoping for. But he was like, oh. Yes. So it's like, okay, well now he thinks I'm a stalker, and I'm gonna like clip his hair or something. I don't know what he's thinking right now, but he does not want to be in the room anymore. That was my first comment when I got in the room. I didn't tell him that I had my last remaining Star Wars action figure in my pocket for good luck. Yeah, my mom secretly sold everything when I was like 8 years old, but there was one that was so ugly that it wouldn't sell. It was like Hammerhead was the character. So literally no one wanted to buy it. So it's the last one I've left, and it's somewhere in my daughter's toys from when she was like 6. But anyway, so I had that in my pocket.
Good thing it didn't drop out during the interview.
It shows you this is how to be a professional journalist. Seminar 101.
This is kind of a related question I saw before from Alex Evans. What's the most memorable story that you've covered?
Well, memorable story, I guess I worked on 9/11. that definitely was intense. I was actually running I was the number 2 person on the website at that time, and just working in that newsroom. But there would never be a story more important that I've ever will cover, and certainly that I ever did. And it was just such an intense experience at the time to be in that newsroom and see everyone. It's like, that's why you went into journalism. Whatever your concentration was, like in that moment, you had to tell people's stories. You had to tell people's last stories. You had to, give people details to help calm, to avoid panic and things like that. So it was very much a very inspirational experience for me, especially because my wife was there at the World Trade Center. She worked in the South Tower, but obviously she survived. But yeah, so it was like that was the most memorable story. And it's probably not the answer you'd be expecting, but that definitely.
At that point, were you ready covering entertainment? Because it was all hands on deck.
No, I didn't. I transitioned to entertainment later. I did cover a little bit of comic books by that point, but for the most part, I was middle management on the website. So I was like I was actually running the day shift, but I couldn't leave my home till I heard back from my wife. My wife's Japanese, and her family was calling from Japan because it was on prime time, and I couldn't get a hold of her for like an hour. So I got the person who runs the night shift to cover the day shift, and then I covered the night shift. So I worked, we worked like, when I got to the newsroom, it was like 16 hours, I think.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like you were saying, sports journalists, movie reviewers, and the traditional hard news reporters all together. It didn't matter what your background is.
They sent the the Broadway critic to there were so many hospitals, because at that point we didn't know how many were wounded. Unfortunately, those people were not brought to the hospitals, but at the time we didn't know, so they were sending like the theater critic to cover this hospital because they didn't have enough news reporters. They had to send most of the news reporters down to as close to the scene as they could get. Obviously, they couldn't get right to the scene. We had one photographer who's David Hanshu, who was almost killed, but his legs were crushed because when the second tower hit, he was snapping pictures on the first one, and the debris. He was lucky to live. So yeah, it was just to be a small part of that team on that day, and that day and those weeks, because it didn't really stop for a long time.
Yeah, and it's a story obviously we're thinking about right now because we're conducting this right after the anniversary of September 11th. All right, let's see if we have one more question or two.
As many as you want.
Well,
you're my ride back, so you can keep me here as long as
that's
you
right.
want.
We've got him. So Sarah Tawfiq, who's been doing our social media for us and is our publicity director for the SBJ chapter, what skills do you find most important to succeed in journalism?
That's a very good question. I'm going to give you 2 parts to this answer. One, practical skills. I think at this time, you should all be very comfortable with social media, analytics, and video. If you can master all 3 of those, that just gives you an in to a lot of places, because that's a lot of places are looking for those sorts of things. There's also things like podcasting. But if you master those skills so you can shoot your own video, it doesn't mean that you have to be an Oscar caliber cinematographer, but you should know your way around Final Cut, a Premiere, something like that. Just because it gives you a leg up on a lot of other people that may be more, just concentrating on the writing and reporting. So I do think it pays to have some of those skills as you're looking for jobs, because that will just open up more for you. Especially now, a lot of places like Mashable and other places, like they're more video driven nowadays, so it just helps you. So that's the practical answer. I think the less literal answer is, I think you need, number 1, to love what you're doing. You need to be tenacious and do some things that make you feel uncomfortable. Like, for example, if you're covering a crime scene, you have to go and ask strangers questions. If you're interviewing a celebrity, you sometimes have to ask uncomfortable questions. And even if they look at you like they hate you, you have to do it. Like, you have to get used to that. Doesn't mean you have to be a jerk, but you be fair, and you be responsible, and you be ethical, but you have to do sometimes things that make you uncomfortable, so you have to have that. I think you also have to have the ability to take criticism and learn from it. So when you hand in something and your editor trashes it and rewrites it completely, it doesn't mean you can't write. It doesn't mean that, that, oh my God, I'm going to quit journalism and go into something else. It means learn from what they're telling you. And you may not agree with it all the time, but sometimes they have a better sense of what the audience is looking for. And other times, you just, if you keep working with them, they'll start to listen to you. And so if you say, I don't feel comfortable with this edit because this, then they'll start listening to you. But if you say, I don't want to do anything that you're doing, then they tune you out. So a lot of it is like learning to accept and not take it personally and that's a big thing, because a lot of like very young reporters, when they start, it's sobering to them, because like maybe they were the stars of their college newspaper, but then when they get there, part of it is a rite of passage, because like, the older the editors are, they tend to be more bitter. So like they don't really sugarcoat things, but at the same time, you have a lot that you can learn from them if you have an open mind about it. And my dad used to say, this shows you how old this expression is, but he used to say, even Pete Sampras has a tennis coach. I could say it now, like even Serena Williams has a tennis coach. There's nobody on the planet who can play better than Serena Williams. So like if she was playing her coach, she would wipe the floor with him, but like there's always, they can always spot something that she's doing slightly wrong and make her better. So there's never a case, there's no reporter who doesn't need an editor. So just, I guess, learning from that. That's like a long-winded answer.
No, I think that was a terrific answer. I think that's a great thing, especially as we're still learning how to accept criticism as young journalists.
Yeah.
So we have Joel Roman asks, is there a person that you would like to interview but you haven't done so yet?
Well, Harrison Ford would be up there. I mean, there are a lot, actually. Some of whom I probably miss because they're dead. But they died, I'd always been angling to try to interview them, and they had passed away. I'm drawing a blank now on some of them. But definitely Harrison Ford was definitely up there because he was high on my list. I would have liked to have interviewed Denzel Washington. I have never interviewed him. God, there's so many.
Why do you say, Harrison Ford we know because of the Star Wars connection, but Denzel Washington, what is it about him?
I like the way he's handled his career. I think he's a very smart guy, and I would just love to be able to sit and chat with. There's sometimes, I think in answer to a previous question, one of the best interviews I ever did was actually Danny Boyle, who's director of Slumdog Millionaire. And it was not necessarily the type of person I would say, like, going in that, oh, this is going to be a great interview, but we had breakfast together, and it was like, we talked about 9/11, which was fresher at the time. I think it was 2005 or 6 or something. And he told me like that he was filming 28 days later, and like they weren't sure if they had to evacuate because they were near a district in London where there was potential for terrorism, and like at the time because they weren't sure what was going on. But then they would go shoot a scene. It was a zombie movie, and they would go shoot a scene. And this was in an apartment that they were filming at the time. And then in the other room, they would have the television. So after they cut, they'd go and watch the television. So these are like these little anecdotes that I always just loved, to hear the stories. Like, it's not just, there's a high-profile actor I want to interview. It's also like, I want to hear the stories that are special to them without it being like a cynical, like, here's a talking point that I want to get across for this movie.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll see if we have anything else up here. Not much, I think. But
what's happening next week on Monday? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that was for you. That was when this was happening.
Well, I do know the answer to that.
There were a few other quick things before you go that I know that you had said you wanted to share with our audience. Is first of all, transition to how you became a comic book writer, because you covered comic books and then now you're writing them. So how did that all work out? This
will only be of interest to the person in the white hat who tried to hide the comic book love earlier. So what happened was I was thinking about leaving the Daily News. I had this buyout coming up where there was the opportunity for a buyout, so I was able to leave with like 7 months' pay. Because I kind of wanted to try something different. I'd been there 20 years, but I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. And one of my closest friends is this guy, Joe Quesada, who's the CCO Chief Creative Officer of Marvel Entertainment. I knew him for years, never crossed church and state at all. If he told me something about something that was happening on one of the movies, never said anything. Basically never told me anything anyway, so it was easy. But I would never cross that line. It's not something I would do. But I had this idea for a Star Wars comic book, and it was like kind of like an itch in my brain that I couldn't scratch. So I just asked him, okay, hypothetically, if I pitched you a spec script, would you read it? And on the off chance that Marvel would publish it, I'll donate the proceeds to charity, because I was still at the Daily News at the time. So he said, sure, like that tone of voice. And it took him 4 months to read it, because he later told me he was so sure it was going to be terrible. And then how does he have that conversation with me? Because it's going to be awkward. But I was like, look, I get yelled at every day at the at a newspaper. Less now. At the NBC News is very polite. But you live the Daily News life.
Yes.
So anyway, he read it. He loved it. He then brought it to the editor-in-chief. Ultimately, Lucasfilm did not allow it to be published, but they liked it enough that they started talking to me about other stuff. So then I started about a year ago. My first comics came out, and I have more stuff coming out in the next couple of years. So it's almost a full-time job, but not quite. So in order to help pay the bills, I continue with journalism, and I love it. I love the balance of having like 2-3 days a week where I'm a journalist, and then 3-4 days a week where I'm writing comic books.
Yeah. Well, and I think it just goes to show too that if you're a curious mind, a creative mind, intelligence, these are the kinds of traits we see with journalists a lot. But you also, you introduce yourself into all these different situations that can then lead to different sorts of jobs down the line. So the fact that you grew up, reading these comic books, but then you also then experience the other side of being a reporter, it starts to help you make contacts or just understand how the industry is run.
I think one key takeaway I want you all to get if you are going to go into journalism is I think the big change, I think the industry is transforming and we don't 100% know where it's going. So I think like in our day, we could go, it's like, oh my God, the New York Daily News is one of the biggest news outlets in the country. I'm so happy to be there, and I can be there as long as I want because, it's like a battleship. It's not going to sink, but it's sinking. And some of these outlets are sinking. And I think the key is your generation, you have to be your own brand name, if that makes any sense. So you have to find something that you do really well. And it's like, people think of you for that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And part of it could be on social media as well. Do you all know Sean King? Do they mean anything to you? Okay. So he was a columnist at the Daily News not that long ago. And before that, was he at the Intercept? No, I can't remember where it was. But anyway, so he, and I've talked to him about this, like he made his first goal to be accessible to his followers on social media. They share information. It's not a one-way street. He gets information from, about a case of police brutality or a case of something else. He gets it from followers. He then uses his mass platform to share that. So he's now known for being like a social justice presence, right? So from there, he can write columns for this outlet, right? For another outlet. He can teach. He can do all these things because he's known. Sean King is, and I don't mean it in a cynical way, he's a brand name, right? Another former coworker of mine, Sarah Kendzior, I don't know if you know who she is, but she predicted that Trump was going to win like 2 years earlier, and she was studying authoritarian regimes in Eastern Europe, I think, or maybe the stands. And she wrote a book, and she was on social media, and she built a brand name. So now she's on MSNBC. She got a book deal. And so now she struggled for many years financially, but she really believed, and she really studied, and she really knew her material so that she is a brand name. So I think like brand name probably makes it sound a little bit more commercial than I mean, but the important thing is you find something that you can give, you can sort of become an expert in, that you can develop into expressing it on various platforms, and that will be, I think, the wave of the future. Right. So like maybe, you write a column for NBC News, and maybe you write books as well, and maybe you have a social media, maybe you have an Instagram thing where you've filmed short little documentaries, but it all adds. But it's sort of like you're the common denominator. I know maybe that sounds crazy, but I really do think that's the way to be successful in this industry going forward, is to not be completely dependent on being like, oh, I want to be a worker bee for NBC News or CNN or whatever it is. Like, kind of find something that you are known for yourself.
Terrific. That's great advice. Well, so we're going to close our discussion. I do want people to stick around because I want to talk about some other events that we're going to be running. But I want to first thank you, Ethan, for coming out here. Thank you so much. I think it was just terrific advice for everybody here.